Hey, good morning. So I really love following Benjamin because first of all, he's so animated. It's just everybody is like ready to go into the next data session, which this is for sure. So for those of you who don't know, I'm actually an American expat. And I've been studying what happened in the United States and how we got to this point. And I've come to this conclusion that there's 5 essential underpinnings to freedom and democracy. And those are education, housing, healthcare, mobility, and the right to work. And as a professional, a lifelong professional in the real estate industry, I've come around to believing that the housing sector is the most essential part of our contribution to democracy and freedom. And in this presentation, I think it's really important that we reflect on how our tenants are feeling about the affordability issues, about how well the housing that we have available is meeting their needs. And this is a deep dive into those subjects. From your perspective, this is extra important because we are getting into an affordability squeeze. And it's really important that owners and builders of property focus on spending the money on the stuff that really matters. Because all the other segments of the economy have their own momentum to them, and we're really at that inflection point. And as Benjamin said, that if we don't take care of these issues, the government will take care of these issues for us in their sometimes unintended consequences way. So these are the top 5 reasons why I think this report is really important to everybody in this room and everybody in the industry, and that is calibrating our investments so that we get the most bang for the buck. So this year, we promised to look at a few things in a much deeper dive. There was quite an expanded group that were involved in the focus group developing the questions. I think in looking at the results, we give ourselves an A on 2 subjects, which is we definitely increased the number of questions and detail and forecasting around what tenants are willing to pay for green technology, quality of operations, and development features. We had a very broad participation increase. You'll see there's 12,000 people who completed the survey this year, but we weren't as successful as we'd hoped in increasing the geographic reach. And critically, especially after the comments by Benjamin, we made a concerted effort to increase the participation by condo tenants, and it's a C+ on that one. We have more, but they're not broad-based enough, and we need to get more, particularly if half of the condos are going into the rental market. So as a bonus, we've got a lot of information this year that gets very, very granular. I'm only going to show you a tiny fraction of that about how much people are willing to pay for certain types of changes in the stock that they receive. So this year, we've decided to go back to the Excel format. Tableau was introduced last year, and bless you, it seems that many people had a struggle with learning a new technology to work with this data. So this is a simple Excel template, and you can put in all the different factors that you want to look at and compare them in as much granularity as you want. Identify Edmonton, identify, I want to know renters under the age of 30. I want to know how they feel about balconies. You know, that kind of granularity is really easy to work with in this year's template, and we invite you to engage with Informa, both in reviewing this information for your own projects and preparing for next year. So, macro level. As I mentioned, we had 12,000 Canadians respond to the survey this year. We had several gold sponsors who actually pushed the survey out into their units. So going back to the prior slide, think about this. If you're building condos this year, please think about how you can help us get this survey populated in your units. Don't just walk away at the end of the deal. Think about how to engage those condo associations with getting this information from those residents. A lot more questions, a lot larger focus on what people are willing to pay for and what they're not. So let's get started. Geographically, last year you'll recall that 50% of the responses were from Toronto and a big slug, about two-thirds from just Toronto and Vancouver. Vancouver dropped off a bit this year, and I think part of the reason for that is that a high percentage of the people renting in Vancouver are actually renting condos, and we had a big surge increase in the responses from Alberta and the responses from Ottawa, which is great. So you'll see there's a nice broad cross-section, more or less representative of the smaller towns in Lower Ontario, but that British Columbia and Quebec focus needs attention for next year. So on to who responded. So most of the people who responded are actually in purpose-built rentals. Only 9% of the population came from condominiums. That's a big increase from last year, but it's not good enough for us to get the granularity that we're really hoping to achieve with this agreement. And if you're taking photographs, I believe this presentation will be available to everybody who registered afterwards. So. Most of the people who responded are actually living in two-people households, and there were fewer dependents, although still more than we expected. A third of all the people that responded to this survey do have children or parents living with them, mostly children as it works out. And for some reason, the percentage of people that responded dropped in terms of their employment status. Not sure whether that's just who had the time in the household to respond to the survey or what. Good news, a majority of the people who responded were female. The consumer specialists tell us that women have a disproportionate role in making household decisions, so that, I think, underscores the fact that this is pretty good data. Again, 44% of the respondents were married or in common law relationships. That's significantly higher than what you would see in the United States, and I think reflects the fact that housing in Canada is just a lot more expensive. So age, again, our big target area was what we hit, which is 30 to 50 years of age. It represented 40% of the sample, and we had a very nice representation from older Canadians who are, by choice mostly, renting. 45% of the owners own a pet. Of the respondents own a pet. That was very consistent with last year, and we did ask a lot more pet questions, and they actually didn't score that well. So people are finding that they are able to accommodate pets in their units, and they don't need a lot of extra services related to that to accommodate that. So this year we found that last year almost 40% of our renters had been in place for 6 or more years. That was quite astonishing because the perception is that the apartment market has more mobility than that. This year we saw an increase in more recent moves. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that we are seeing more purpose-built construction across the country. So surprises. 49-50% of Canadians actually are renting 2 or more bedrooms. Now, we talked about this each of the last 2 years because those numbers are a lot higher than people think. And about 3/4 of what we're building is actually 1-bedroom or studios, whereas half of all the renters are looking for larger units. 60% of the people had dependents. That is an increase in the numbers, and 40% had youthful dependents, people under the age of 10. So 78% said that they have 1 bathroom, and we're going to go into deep detail on bathrooms later on. It's about 80% of the renters that are looking for 2 bathrooms, sorry. So that was a big finding in this year's profiles. So if you recall from last year, we do a granular assessment across the amenity profile. Is this something that's essential and you wouldn't consider renting without? Is this a nice to have? Is this a neutral? Is this it's my building has it, but I don't really use it? Or is this something that is of no interest to me? So when you start looking at the preference categories, sometimes you get a real different answer about what is absolutely critical from what is absolutely desirable. And we find that combining essential and nice to have generally gives the best picture Another change this year from last is that we combined all of the attributes around apartments, so locations, amenities, features, layouts, and so on, into one big spreadsheet. And let me see if I can get to that. Nope, okay, I'll back up. I'll show you how that works in a minute. But it gave us some different answers, and it really told us how does location stack up with the number of bedrooms? How does it stack up with washers and dryers, so that you're really getting a much clearer picture on how to prioritize the money as a total pot. So lots and lots of new questions. These are some select examples. Lots of new detailed questions and really forward-looking questions about the amenities and the features in the units. Configurational questions really focused on bedrooms, bathrooms, and balconies for the purposes of today's presentation, but there's many other illustrations. Talked a little bit about detailed technologies, because that had been scoring high in the last 2 years as something that the tenants were frustrated about. More details, similar to last year, but a little more granularity about how people are making their selection, why they are renting versus owning, and what those proclivities are. It sounds like that's getting increasingly important as more of the condominiums are being rented and delivered in the market for such. And then lastly, we did a pretty deep dive on how the tenants feel about the quality of management, the quality of service response, and so on. So let's get into it. New build and bathrooms. So we asked the question point blank: are you in a condo? Are you in a purpose-built rental unit? Do you worry if you're in a condo that the unit will be sold out from under you? And this is clearly a bifurcated market. People are really worried in Vancouver and Toronto, where the appreciation has been spectacular, and not so much in Alberta and Ottawa, where that is not the case. Interestingly, amenities were more important to the apartment renters than the condominium renters. And you think about the fact that maybe that's partly because the condominiums tend to be more amenitized, but it was also an interesting feature because that isn't necessarily going to bind somebody to a condo rental decision. In terms of bathrooms, I mentioned this earlier, if you add these together, 41-36, we're at 77% of people want to have 2 bathrooms. 22% of them have 2 bathrooms, and only 24% were indifferent to whether they had 2 bathrooms. This is a big deal, and so we also went the next step and looked at what configuration would satisfy your requirement there: a powder room with a full bath or 2 full baths, and these are the results. How much value does that bring? These are really big numbers. Really big numbers, and these are set up as a monthly basis. So most people said it was worth $50 to $150 a month of extra rent to get a powder room. That's pretty good. But there were also 5% of people who said they'd pay $300 or more. And my guess is that a lot of those people are in Vancouver or Toronto, not so much in other markets where the affordability issues aren't so crippling. Ensuite, less essential. Nice to have. Essential combined, that's about a 70% score. Shower or tub, 85% of the people still need a tub, and that probably reflects the number of dependents and the percentage of dependents that are under the age of 10. So balconies, we also did a deep dive there, and balconies are still coming up at the very top of the list. Whether people use them or not is sort of irrelevant. People really want them. We looked into whether balcony could be provided as a common area amenity, and that would satisfy the need, and the answer to that question was, in part, about half the people said that they thought that that was a good solution. Would prefer a personal balcony, but that's a good interim step if you don't have a building that is convertible to have balconies today. Would they pay more? Yes. People are willing to pay more. It's not as spectacular as for a bathroom, but people will pay for a balcony, or at least they say they will. Patios and balconies, both are valuable. So we went into e-commerce detail a little bit more. These numbers are steeply increasing. Almost 80% shop online, and most of those people get their deliveries sent to their rental. There's not enough storage. 54% of the people said emphatically no. I'm sure some of the people who say yes aren't actually shopping online. So this is an issue that I think people need to pay attention to. You can't have boxes overflowing in the management office. And the last one on the lower right was in some ways the most, it was surprising and not surprising in that Amazon Key, and this was the same kind of answer for Google Home and some of these other home devices, which just creep me out like no end. But of course, I'm over 50, so I'm in that 3/4 aren't adopting these technologies, but young people are, and it's very common across the country, and the results across that demographic were highly consistent. So electric vehicles, the take-up, and I'm a great testimony to this. I've been on a wait list for an electric car for 3 years. Right now, I don't even own a car. But only 1% of the respondents had an electric vehicle, but 2% of them say that having an electric car charging station is essential to how they made their rental decisions. So I'm not sure where that is headed other than they are planning to buy an electric vehicle, and I think people are serious about this. We also found that 7% of the people, the ones that want to have charging stations, are willing to pay for that, and in some cases, substantially. This is another surprise, maybe not so much given that the preponderance of these respondents were in Vancouver and they have very cheap electric rates in Vancouver compared to gasoline cars, but this kind of granularity was requested by the development community. In terms of energy certifications, we also tried to quantify that, and 75% of renters reported that that's great to have, but they're not really willing to pay more for it. I think that reflects somewhat the affordability issues. But for those people who really care, that 10% of people who said, yeah, I wouldn't, it is an absolute essential thing to me to be in a building that has energy certifications, how much they were willing to pay was a real shock, $100 to $500 a month to be in a green building. So to the extent that this is helpful in terms of your calculus about how you're investing your dollars, for those people who care, they care a lot, and they're deciding with their feet. So the biggest outliers here in terms of what people would pay for were not that much of a surprise. In-suite laundry got a very good score, especially compared to a kitchen renovation, and the cost related to those two items is quite a bit different. Bathroom upgrades, bedroom upgrades were also highly featured. Smart thermostats, I think, was the big surprise in terms of this overall list. $17 a month more for smart thermostats. Now, this is the average. So we're talking about a bell curve here from 0 to, I don't know what, 100. But smart thermostats are pretty cheap. And $17 a month, I don't know what that makes the payback, 2 months, 3 months, but that's a good to know. Priorities. So this was very similar to last year. This doesn't change. We are seeing a little bit of granularity between the different cities, especially with a lot more Alberta respondents. There's just less emphasis on transit in Alberta than other parts of Canada. But when you back up to the whole aggregated level, grocery store comes out on top every time. Transit is important, close to work is important, and then the rest of it is somewhat toggling between the items. Reasons for renting, again, there are when we get to the affordability section, these are the answers that people give. They're not saying because I can't afford it point blank. They're saying I'm trying to save for a down payment. I like the flexibility and so on. So far, we're pretty good. This is not the sign of a major disgruntled population that's going to force political change. 34% of the respondents said point blank they'd prefer a rental and new purpose-built rental. That's actually hard to say when you're in front of 800 people. And 24% said they prefer a house and townhouse. So that's, I guess, bad news for the condo rental speculators. Only 14% of respondents said they prefer a condo, and maybe next year we'll get into why that might be the case and ask people to add some color on there. So, affordability. Here's the bad news. 30% of your income to housing is considered a threshold for reasonable housing payments. And basically every major city in Canada is currently priced above that level. And the median income of the surveyed actually almost dead hit the average income of a Canadian. So this is basically where we are. We're tipping over the affordability threshold, some cities more than others, and it's definitely coast to coast. The recession in Calgary hasn't helped this measure really much at all. So current monthly rents, you start to see the difference between the markets in Alberta, the affordability of the Alberta markets as compared to the Toronto markets. We also, because of the participation of Alberta, got less skew to the upper range. $1,100 a month is the national, let's say, preponderance. The average was $1,350 when you were just looking at Toronto and Vancouver. Here's the numbers by city and what percentage of the renters are paying those numbers. I was surprised that Ottawa was quite a bit cheaper than the other major Canadian cities, but from an affordability perspective, the average wages must be lower. Same with London. Now, we asked this question this year, and it's again an attitudinal question to put a pulse on how are people feeling about how much they're having to pay for housing. And you see these budget line items, and obviously the renters in Toronto either have more income or have a better handle on the runaway affordability issues locally. But as you put them side by side, blue is what people would like to pay. Green is what they're actually having to pay. And we're going to get to later how happy they are with the units that they're actually renting. Cars. Again, because we had quite a nice sample size in Alberta, we found that more people this year reported owning cars than did last year. That actually even happened in Toronto and Vancouver, where in those cases, both of the cities that were indicating that more people have cars than we had previously shown. So again, in each of these cities, there are fewer cars than people think. If you're working in a zoning area where you're required to provide one car per bedroom, chances are you're overparking your building. And I'm trying to encourage, and all of us should encourage, this information into the hands of our planning directors, because it's one of the cheapest ways that we can reduce costs and help with the affordability issue. So, commuting. Driving is only 50% of the method that was reported by the 12,000 people that answered this survey. And bike, Uber, and taxi, which is growing in popularity in many US cities, particularly the ones that are populated by millennials. And electric scooters didn't make our survey, but that's actually the fastest growing segment in the US of how people are commuting. And people really organize their rental units in proximity to work. That didn't show up in the location preference survey at the top of the list, but it did when 78% were saying that that was really important to them. So commute times obviously vary for families versus singles, but they're not too bad. And that's reflecting the fact that people are choosing locations that are close to where they work. And these numbers actually improved a little bit in terms of the really long commutes. 20 to 30 minutes is an average in Canada, but renters are doing that less than homeowners. Moving into dynamics. So this is a question about how long it took you to buy, or how long it took you to identify a satisfactory unit. And it was better than last year, which reflects the increase in supply. But people are starting their searches way in advance, like at least 2 to 6 months, with 7% of people looking for more than 6 months. I'm assuming those are the people that are really fussy. So these statistics are pretty good. That is not a high level of frustration. 32%, it did take 1 to 2 months, but that's not so bad. The condition of the units, most people feel that their rental situation is pretty average. Only 14% said they thought that the condition of their unit was excellent, so there's some work for ambitious landlords to do there. But very few said that there was a real problem. Poor or total disrepair only came in at 4%. So well done there. Most apartments, at least were part of this survey, do have on-site managers. And the managers also got high marks, with over 50% getting very high or high quality marks. When you see the granularity of this, there is an issue in that 28% of the renters indicated that they are not very satisfied with their managers, and they would not recommend the units to a friend. When we get to the how you got your unit question, you'll see why that's a problem. So there's also work to do here, and there's an opportunity for owners of property and managers to distinguish themselves in this category. So 2/3 say yes, the unit is meeting their needs, and 56 would pay more to get their service requirements done faster and better the first time. So that's important. And I would guess that that turns into turnover statistics. Now, the market's very tight, so people are circumspect about trying to find a new place, but management does matter. Would they pay more rent to be fully satisfied with a renovated unit? Yeah, 85% say yes, despite the fact that most people are paying more than they technically can afford. So, what were the reasons why they felt that their rental wasn't meeting their needs? And the number one reason is lack of space, and that it shows up in the trade-offs between location and size. Every single time tenants pick, the location's more important to me than the size of the unit. The configuration's more important to me than the size of the unit. Transit access is more important than the size of the unit. So this is a good one to just bear in mind in context. Appliances shows up pretty well too. In terms of the nice to have, microwaves always hits the top of the list. How much is a bedroom worth? Surprisingly, an extra bedroom's worth less to people than an extra bathroom, but there were still a good percentage of people who said that they would pay significantly more, and that reflects the shortage of 2 and 3 bedroom units in the market. So, in terms of purchases, 50% of people want to own a home, or at least they report that they want to own a home. 60% actually. 22% say, no way, I'm not doing that. And the question here really comes down to whether people will actually be able to afford it. But as we look at the speculative inventory that's coming into the market annually, these statistics, and they're rising, and it could be because Benjamin says that people are more cognizant of the appreciation that's been enjoyed in the market, but these figures are at least a little bit disconcerting. So here's the list of preferences and amenities that were surveyed. I highlighted the ones that are really important, and they're singled out on the next couple of slides. So essential really does relate to things that are critically essential, like if you don't have a washer dryer in your unit, you need it in the building. High-speed internet, which scored the highest last year, actually dropped on this essential list, although it is high on the nice to have and would not rent without a combined unit. So going to what is essential, we also asked them how much are they willing to pay. And the highlighted ones are the ones that are above $15 a month, which some of these are highly cost effective. I don't know how you create soundproof walls in an existing unit for $15 a month additional rent, but for those of you who are working in the new build or the deep reno category, that's an important one to note because it scored the highest on this list. So, not important. This list looked very similar to last year. One thing I noted is that car sharing in business centers, which are 2 of the top 5 features that American urban renters say they need, are not important to Canadians so far, and that obviously families put higher value on toddler and family rooms and generally the common area amenities. So, again, when you combine the top 2 categories, soundproof walls back up at the top, which probably reflects why 22% of the people said they would move into a purpose-built rental if it was available at their price point. Patio and balcony, this gives you an indication of how highly that ranks. And we had a new category here this year. I'm not sure exactly what that means, air barriers. I don't know if that's about sound or smells or what's going on there, but that turned up pretty highly on this scoring. So on to operations, and I'm going to try and pick up the pace here. We got started a little late. Satisfaction. So again, the service requests are getting a high level of satisfaction, 21% rating that at a 10, but there's still room for improvement. And we also asked about whether you'd had a management change during the year and you noticed a change in service, and about 30% of the people responded that they had seen either an improvement or a decrease in the service quality. We asked this question last year, but we asked it in a lot more detail this year. Basically, tenants prefer not to talk to their landlord. They want to communicate by email. They want to pay by email or by Interact. And that tendency continues to show up in the gap between what people do and what they want. They're finding their rentals online. This is true everywhere. It is less true in Alberta than it is in some of the other markets, because you can see that the online listing service ticked down a little bit. But the website and the web presence and the permanence of these mobile technologies to communicate at not just as a first point of contact, but in terms of the full process engagement is increasing. So we asked people about whether they looked at the building's website and the manager's website and whether that mattered, and 73% said yes, websites matter. People are moving onto the internet for their research, and it is an important part of the vetting process, and those scores that people post also matter. So here's payment technologies. You see, the only thing that really disturbed me on this list was the 14% would prefer to pay with credit card. That's new. We didn't ask this question last year because it didn't occur to us that people might be paying their rent with credit cards, but I'm not sure that that's something that I'm going to switch to in terms of the units that we oversee for our pension investors, but it's good to know that that's where people are thinking. I think it's indication of the affordability squeeze. Community portals, this scored very similar to last year. It ticked up a little bit. About a little more than half of the communities have one. A little more than half of the people use it, and about half said that they would use it if there was one. This is another point of differentiation, but the adoption rate is definitely not 70%. Parking, on the other hand, was, and part of this again is the increase in answers from Alberta. And 71% have a designated spot, and 21% don't even need a parking spot. So 7% of people are using the parking, and it's first come, first serve, and they did say that they had sufficient parking and they would pay for additional parking. So how much do you pay for parking? Obviously, this is another regional variation. It's quite a bit of increased cost in a place like Toronto over a place like Edmonton, but people are paying for parking. The preponderance of renters across Canada are paying for parking, and they're willing to pay for parking. So, in conclusion, here's the key findings. What can you do that costs a little bit but has big impact? The answer is Wi-Fi, designated parking, and smart thermostats. Good to know. Medium dollars, big impact. In-suite laundry, that was the thing that people were most willing to pay for. It requires some plumbing adoptions, but if you're doing a kitchen reno, even if you're doing a bathroom reno and your configuration accommodates it, that's a big payback. Shared balcony and deck, went into some of the detail on that. If you get the survey, you can actually toggle it for your location, city, and target renter age group and find out where that works. That was more preferred by younger renters than older renters as a trade-off from a regular balcony. Big impact. No surprise there, additional bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchen rentals. That's what people are willing to pay the big bucks for. The growing affordability gap, we all want to mind this carefully. Please help us get more condo respondents next year. Give us your ideas. Help us figure out how to reach that target population. And parking still matters, particularly outside of Vancouver and Toronto, where there's better transit or better walkability. Management and websites matter. That was the biggest takeaway this year because we had the most new questions in that category. And if you want to see benchmark your group's performance over other landlords in your location, this survey gives you all the information you need. So what's next? We're going to pull together the focus groups again and vet these questions, figure out which ones we want to toss and what new questions we want to ask. If you want to participate in that, check in at the registration desk. Let people know. You'll get on the mailing to participate in that. Informa prepares a white paper that goes into more details than my keynote presentation. And there's quite a bit of deeper analysis that we've done across these variables. We just tried to point out the highlights here. So I want to thank our sponsors. We had about double the number that we had last year, and a special thanks to Sarah Siegel, who's sitting up here in the front. And if you value this information the way that I do, and I feel like it is so essential to our mission to deliver product that people want for a price that they can afford. Thanks, Sarah, because she goes to Herculean efforts to get these surveys populated, to collect the information, to crunch the data, and help with the preparation of this presentation every year. So, thank you very much.